Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and welcome back to another episode of Jin'talks. In this episode I'm going to be doing the same thing that I did with my What's Wrong with Wardex article, and basing a video entirely on an article that I wrote for INN. If you want to read the article instead of listening to it, feel free to click the link in the description below. So the autocannons have kind of been considered the black sheep of the weapon systems by the community for a long time. And, medium autocannons being bad especially is something that's brought up quite a lot on Reddit whenever balancing concerns or the fact that balancing hasn't been done is brought up. So I wanted to explore some of the reasons why people suggest that autocannons are bad and lay out some real-world examples of how that plays out in actual fights. In order to give a good grounding for how we could potentially address this and make them feel a bit better to use, without making them overpowered and better than any other weapon system in a specific area where it's supposed to be weak. Before we go into that, however, I really wanted to dig into what autocannons are supposed to be good at so that we can understand kind of the intention of the weapon system. And there's four main things that I really consider to be the points of power within autocannons, at least on paper. The first of these is versatility, because like artillery, autocannons have access to the projectile ammo line, and that allows them to modulate their range relatively well because they have access to a lot of ammunition with different range types. But alongside that, they also have the ability to choose their damage types at these different ranges, which is something that other weapon systems don't have the ability to do, with the exception of missiles and drones. And in theory this gives the autocannons the ability to adapt in the battlefield to the situation they're facing and make a better choice than their opponent, as long as they can figure out what would give them an advantage. The second point of power that autocannons are supposed to have is their good application, and as you can see they sit kind of in the middle between pulses and blasters in terms of the tracking score which is given to them by CCP, which serves as a good way to estimate relative tracking ability, although it's not perfect, especially between gun classes like large guns, medium guns and small guns. Autocannons also sit in roughly the middle of the range pack, having a little more range than the neutron blasters but a lot less than the heavy pulse lasers. It's worth noting that the majority of their range actually comes from their fall-off rather than their optimal. And finally, the advantage that I think is the most important to them, at least right now, is their low fitting costs. And that's something that really plays into their ability to be used on ships with extra utility highs, or ships that have relatively high fitting constraints, such as ships that are trying to use multiple XLASBs or other really fitting intensive tank setups. There is one other advantage which I didn't mention in my article which I should bring up, and that's the fact that projectile weapons in general and autocannons as a part of that do not use capacitor when firing. However, I find this to be a relatively negligible bonus in the modern meta. Due to the fact that capacitor rebalances have generally always been in the positive direction, overall the game doesn't have the same level of cap problems inherent to its ships as we did back in 2012, and because of that the loss in cap usage from using autocannons over any other weapon system is relatively negligible, as most cap using weapon platforms now have a good enough cap to be able to deal with that and still operate effectively for 3 to 4 minutes, and a really good pilot can manage their modules in such a way to impact the battlefield at the same level without really having to worry about their capacitor in the long term. The one benefit it really does give in combat is being able to still fire your guns when you're neutered out. However, I found that to be relatively negligible again as an actual combat bonus. I've generally found that when I've been neutered out in a Minmatar platform, the fact that my tank no longer works and the fact that I can no longer hold range control with webs and scrams means that my guns aren't doing any damage anyway, so I've already effectively lost the fight. Your experiences may be different on this, however, and I encourage you to let me know in the comments if you think it is a big enough bonus to justify its weaknesses in the other areas. As demonstrated by this amazing infographic, which I did not make, and I will link the creator of it and their post of this graph and graphs for all other weapon systems in the description below, you can see that projectiles have a large range of options to choose from in terms of their damage options. However, any form of mid-fight adaptation to changing circumstances is, almost as a rule, never worth it in a solo situation, meaning that you actually can't gain an advantage from this theoretical versatility. In order to show why I believe this, let's take a look at a really boiled down example, with yourself and a rifter being kited by any frigate, it doesn't matter what it is, orbiting you at about 8 kilometers. Let's say that you started this fight with a bad ammo type, like fusion or some other close-range ammo type, as they all have the same projection profile. At that range, you're going to be doing a little under half your paper DPS at 77. And upon seeing that you're being scram-kited, or you're fighting someone who is going to scram-kite you, you might consider changing to Barrage, the Tech 2 long-range ammo that autocannons have access to. And if you did so, you'd be dealing a whole 7 DPS more at 84 applied DPS to a target at 8 kilometers, ignoring any tracking difficulties that you might incur. However, here's where the rub is. In order to deal that extra 7 DPS, you had to stop firing for 10 seconds to reload, and that meant that you missed out on 770 points of raw damage. And that means that in order to recoup this loss in damage originally, you'd have to have the fight last 110 seconds, which is just short of 2 minutes, and not something that a frigate fight generally lasts to. And that means that you'd be better off not reloading at all, not adapting, and simply shoot the bad ammo until the fight is over. Part of this is due to the nerf to Barrage that was hidden in the Tiamat release, and that nerf reduced the fall-off bonus of Barrage from 50 to 40%, although that was compensated for with a 7.5% bonus to all base fall-off for autocannons, in order to give projectile weapons less of a reliance on their T2 ammo. However, all this did, as you can see, was make Barrage hopelessly situational, as adding such a small amount of fall-off doesn't really give you that much more damage projection onto a target, or at least not enough to make up for the lengthy reload time of autocannons. But that lengthy reload time doesn't just make T2 ammo worthless for adapting to mid-fight, it also means that you can't effectively switch to different damage types in the middle of a fight in order to take advantage of your weapon platform's versatility. In order to explain why I think this, let's take a look at the Atron, and more specifically how its tank changes based on the ammunition types that we're firing against it. As you can see, the Atron's Ansil adds about 2.26k EHP when it's being fired at with phased plasma, although this doesn't take into account any extra cycles it will get after the nanite repair paste that it's fueled with runs out. And whilst phased plasma is a good damage type, it's not as good as explosive against this hull, so seeing that we might want to switch to fusion, in order to take advantage of the nearly halved resistances versus that damage type. Changing our damage pattern like this means that the Atron loses around 550 EHP from its decreased armor repair effectiveness versus the damage received, but it also gains 100 EHP due to the based shield EHP of the ship and the natural explosive resist there. That means in total, the ship now has 450 EHP less, however it's taken 10 seconds in order to do that, and that means that we've effectively just done 45 damage a second to it over the course of our 10-second break. And that means that mathematically, for this to have been an advantageous play for us to make, we needed to have been doing on average less than 45 DPS for the entirety of the fight for this to make sense. As removing 450 hit points by changing your damage pattern is the same as removing 450 effective hit points by shooting them off. Although it should be noted that it does give you a distinct advantage versus ships that could potentially permanently tank you versus one specific damage type, as it gives you the ability to switch away from that. However, you still have to be able to survive long enough to do that, and that is a task in and of itself. It's also worth mentioning that you can reload before a fight starts, as long as you have intel on how your opponent is fit or what they're going to be flying in order to make an assessment of what damage types are probably going to be best for you. However, as I think I've shown here, when it comes to small autocannons, you are effectively locked in with your ammunition choice, and you can't adapt to the circumstances once they've been forced upon you. However, even having the correct ammo loaded before the fight begins is often not enough to allow an autocannon-based ship to gain a meaningful advantage on the battlefield. Just to give a really big and showy example. It doesn't mean a huge much, but will demonstrate how bad the effective DPS projection of autocannons is. I'm going to present you with a comparison between a Hurricane fit with 6 425mm autocannons and one fit with 6 heavy pulse lasers, with the key range of 16 to 24 kilometers highlighted. As you can see, despite a 25% bonus to damage, a 25% bonus to rate of fire, and a 25% bonus to both optimal range and fall off, all from the hull, autocannons still fall behind unbonused pulse lasers in this range. And I think that demonstrates just how poorly fall off functions as a way to project DPS. You can see that whilst it does still have some DPS longer than the pulse lasers, it's a negligible amount, mostly sub 100 DPS, which isn't going to allow you to kill something before it's able to get out of that range itself, if it's a frigate or something of similar size. This problem of fall-off rapidly degenerating the damage that autocannons can do at range, preventing them from meaningfully using their base level of projection, also impacts their supposedly good application, as whilst they do have a good on-paper tracking, their applied DPS to smaller targets is actually significantly behind systems that are supposed to be worse than it, such as pulse lasers. And in order to demonstrate that, I will be comparing it in these graphs with the Harbinger with pulse lasers loaded. This isn't to say that pulse lasers are a great weapon system or that they're overpowered, just that they provide a good contemporary baseline of a weapon system that is in a relatively positive state. As you can see, they both have the same on-paper DPS at 0, with around 370 each. However, when we simulate the applied damage from these two ships against a moving target, in this case an A being Mala moving at 45 degrees from both ships, you get a graph that looks like this. As you can see, whilst the autocannons lose less DPS than the pulses lose, the pulses have a higher base DPS at range and as such are actually able to apply more damage overall to the target, making them more effective against it than the autocannons. And this is a best case scenario for autocannons, as we're not applying the webs that the Harbinger as an armor ship would be more able to utilise than the Hurricane. To give another example, let's look at how autocannons and pulses compare when dealing with light tackle, in this case a saber. In this case moving at 90 degrees to both ships at max speed in order to give the most impact from tracking possible. Now the colours of the two lines here have been changed around because I'm bad at graphic design, but as you can see 425s are finally starting to find a place where they can do a little bit more damage than pulses. They've got about a 2 kilometer window around the 8 to 10 kilometer mark, where they do more damage than pulses versus this specific target. However, the additional range at DPS here from the autocannon's fall-off is something that we can almost completely ignore in terms of the combat equation, as the Harbingers have the option to simply switch to a longer range ammo type and have no penalty for doing so. Which means that the Hurricane's effective window of power is just in that very specific couple of kilometers range, where a saber may or may not be present depending on the fight that you're having. The traditional counter-argument that's given against the need for an autocannon buff can be neatly shown in the graph provided to the public by CCP in January 2019, which shows the PvP damage of all weapon systems in the game for about 180 days. As you can see, whilst medium autocannons are firmly in the bottom tier of weapon systems, so are pulses and blasters, which means that whilst it is underused, it's not as underused as it possibly could be. However, this is both an argument to popularity, effectively arguing that if enough people are using it, it can't really be that bad, and also an argument that doesn't take into account the fact that Minmatar pilots can only use autocannons if they want a close-range weapon system that their ships are bonus to. And I'd be far more interested in finding out how many ships died with autocannons versus ships were able to kill things with autocannons, or something that would more effectively indicate their ability to impact the battlefield, rather than just their ability to apply damage, which, as we've shown, they can do. It's just that they don't apply damage well enough to really have an advantage over any other weapon system, except when used in very specific circumstances. It also seems likely to me, although I'm slightly less certain about this, that the fact that Minmatar hulls themselves are quite good at keeping the medium autocannon damage higher than it should be. And you can see this demonstrated by the fact that 720mm howitzers, which is the other projectile weapon option that Minmatar pilots have in the medium class, is the most used weapon system by far in terms of actual damage dealt, which implies to me personally that the hulls themselves are actually fairly good. And I'm concerned that we may end up in a situation where Minmatar hulls are nerfed to the point where 720s are balanced to the rest of the weapon systems in the game, simply by the fact that Minmatar hulls have been rebalanced to be on par with everything else, but that would leave the 45 autocannons and the rest of the auto line in an incredibly poor position relative to the field, as they will no longer have these relatively powerful hulls to be used alongside them in order to make up for their weaknesses. In order to end this video on a positive note, however, I've decided to look into some of the things that I think could improve autocannons without overpowering other weapon systems in their existing niches. Keeping to the idea of what autocannons are supposed to be good at without making them better than everything else. And the first solution that I think CCP should look into is actually just reworking the T2 ammo. As I described, Barrage is very, very bad, and Hail is bad in the same way, because it takes away your main advantage of being able to choose your damage types in the first place. Although in situations where you're very, very close range brawling an armor ship, it does have its uses. But that inherently is really the problem of the T2 ammo types for the autocannons. They're very, very situational. And this contrasts with Pulsters and Blasters, both of which have a ammo type which really feeds into their individual strengths and game plan. For example, Void in Blasters giving you huge amounts of close range DPS whilst not having any range, which is fine because you don't want to have any range as a blaster ship in the first place. And in contrast, for Pulsers you have Scorch, which allows you to project a huge amount of distance, which is what Pulsers really need to mitigate the fact that they have on paper very low application. Personally, I think the best way to approach this is not actually to stick with the paradigm of close-range, long-range ammunition that you see in the two other weapon systems, and to give the Minmatar a more specialised mid-range ammunition with a tracking bonus, as that would play into their existing strengths without taking over some of their weaknesses. It's still going to mean that they don't have a lot of projection, and it's still going to mean they don't have insane DPS up close, but it should allow them to perform better in that kind of middling range, good application, anti-tackle sort of role, and be competitive with rapid light ships in that area, due to the fact that they can fire continually whilst rapid light missile ships are slightly better at doing it, but have to reload. And whilst I think numbers should always be up for debate, I'd suggest something like a 0.8 times the DPS of close range ammo for the DPS, and a 1.25 times tracking bonus to the ammunition. This next suggestion doesn't actually come from me, it comes from a friend of mine, Suetonia, who thinks that one of the best ways to differentiate the autocannons from other weapon systems is to give it a heat bonus that would increase the amount of damage it does in a short period of time. This would give autocannons a window early on in the fight where they're the best, whilst retaining their weaknesses later on and making sure that they don't become overpowered in a fleet context. And I think if you wanted to specifically buff autocannons just for the small gang area, this would probably be the best way to do it, as heat is a lot harder to take significant advantage of in a fleet fight context. The final and quickest and dirtiest way to really bring autocannons up to snuff without actually affecting their combat effectiveness is something that CCP's done before, and that's just buffing their reload times. It won't make a huge difference in most of these use cases, but it will still make it more effective to do, and it will give you more of a chance of reloading before a fight starts if you just see someone quickly on D-scan. And this would certainly help minimise their issues described with versatility, although it wouldn't address some of the other weaknesses like application and range. It gives the autocannon user the option of choosing to be mediocre at most ranges after a short delay, instead of having to really commit to be mediocre at one specific range. Still, with all that said, agree with me, disagree with me, whatever. I just wanted to start a conversation on the balanced state of autocannons, and if you would like to contribute with your own thoughts and your own experiences on using the weapon system, please feel to throw them down in the comments below. Also, consider checking out my Twitter and my Discord, which I've linked in the description below. It's been wonderful talking to you, and until next time, fly smart.